Resident Evil, not unlike Final Fantasy, is a series that has seen a lot of ups and downs since its first title. From drastic gameplay changes to spin-offs that really had no right to be a part of its universe, this beloved survival horror franchise is seemingly going through another identity crisis. With 2 games on the horizon, both with drastically different gameplay styles, it seems like now more than ever Capcom might be listening to what the consumers want. I'm sure if you've been on the internet, you know that the later Resident Evil games aren't nearly as well received as the originals. They might have been monetarily successful, but the fans of the series have written at least Resident Evil 6 off as a pile of junk. I've seen a lot of mixed ideas about 5 and even more about 4. The one thing I'm sure we can all agree on, however, is that ever since the 4th game, the franchise had been changing. What started as a claustrophobic survival horror experience is now much more action-oriented. Though the first 3 games were by no means a completely straight-faced story, the later games embraced their cheesiness and came full force with ridiculous set pieces. But what was once the product of bad voice acting and dialogue written by then new video game creators is now purposeful. It lost the charm it had before. I think that they probably thought that all of the Jill sandwich memes meant that people loved that kind of stuff. I'm only really a fan of self-aware humor if it's implemented well, and in my opinion, underlined 3 times, the later entries in the series did not. Fuck it, I'm gonna show Chris punching a boulder again just to prove my point. Got it? Cool. But the last 2 games in this franchise proved to be quite the slap in the face for Capcom. In the same year, they released Resident Evil 6 along with Resident Evil Revelations, which was a 3DS exclusive spin-off title. The weird part about these 2 video games was that Resident Evil Revelations was better received than their big budget counterpart, at least by hardcore fans of the series. But why? Revelations being only on the 3DS came with a lot of limitations. Biggest of all was the controls. Because of the lack of a second analog stick, the game reverted back to its stop and shoot style of gameplay. Instead of being able to aim while you were moving, you had to stop, aim, and then shoot, making the game much more tense. Because of the drastically limited control scheme, the areas in the game had to compensate. The locations were much more cramped and relied more on strategic enemy placement rather than open area shooting galleries. Don't get me wrong, there were some of those, but they weren't nearly as plentiful as in the other titles. Though this mechanically limited style of play may not seem fun, it is exactly what made this survival horror giant what it is today. Let's take a trip down memory lane back to 1996. I wasn't even 10 years old, Bill Clinton was president, and Resident Evil, or Biohazard as it's known in Japan, was released on the Sony PlayStation. This game was originally planned as a remake of the Famicom horror RPG Sweet Home. In the planning period, oddly enough, they wanted to make it a first-person shooter, but series creator Shinji Mikami stated that the first-person view concept technically wasn't good enough. So they ended up looking for inspiration elsewhere. Where they ended up was a game called Alone in the Dark. This title is what most people will call the original survival horror game, even though that the term wasn't really coined until later. This DOS game featured 3D gameplay, tank controls, and fixed camera angles. Sound familiar? At the time, pre-rendered backgrounds were becoming a popular method of development because it allowed for more power to be used on other things, and could give the backgrounds a much greater level of detail than if they were rendered in real time. Though newer consoles are much more like computers, the machines back then weren't nearly as powerful as PCs of the time, so there were a lot of techniques to take advantage of the limited hardware capabilities. The downside to this is that in a 3D environment, this requires the camera to remain at a fixed angle. But these limitations added to what made the games great. The lack of camera control required you to always look where they wanted you to. In any other genre, this might be a pain in the ass, but with horror, this made the creators become something much more like a movie director. You would always be viewing this situation from where they wanted you to look, and any scary or creepy imagery would not be missed because of the player toying with the camera. Now that I'm done with my little history lesson, think about it. It is a little ironic. The more basic RE release of 2012 was the one more hardcore fans of the series liked. Technical limitations have made for a good game more than once. The feedback that Capcom got from this game made them rethink the whole franchise. Back when the Resident Evil remake on the GameCube didn't sell very well, the series was on the verge of cancellation, which made the next entry, Resident Evil 4, undergo a drastic change. Citing Call of Duty's sales as part of the reason, Revelation's producer said this: "Looking at the marketing data for survival horror games, the market is small compared to the number of units Call of Duty and all those action games sell. Survival horror Resident Evil doesn't seem like it'd be able to sell those kinds of numbers." After the release of both games and the subsequent feedback, that same man said, "Survival horror as a genre is never going to be on the same level financially as shooters and much more popular mainstream games. At the same time, I think we need to have confidence to put money behind these projects. And it doesn't mean we can't focus on what we need to do as a survival horror game to meet the fans' needs. We are always taking into account user feedback, even when the users are very upset about something." I know that this is all old news, but we need to rethink this with the two very differently styled games Capcom has dated for this year. The first of which is a sequel to the spin-off in the form of, drumroll please, Resident Evil Revelations 2. It looks much like the first game, but more geared towards consoles. Spin kicks and melee takedowns seem to be making a return, but the game itself seems to be much more focused on atmosphere. If this game sells well and gets great feedback, I'm sure Capcom will step more in this direction for future numbered entries in the series, or if they decide to reboot it entirely. I'm sure the game will be fun, and with a greater focus on horror elements and atmosphere, I'm sure it will be much more like what we expect from Resident Evil. But with the purposeful campiness of the previous games, and the fact that this game will be on consoles with better controls, I foresee this game being much more in line with the main series title. The only reason I bring this up is that there are still a lot of people out there who want to see Capcom really bring it back to its roots instead of sprinkling a little bit of horror on their current formula. The Resident Evil 1 remaster, I feel, will hold a lot more weight in terms of where the company will go in the future. I know a lot of people think it's just a shameless cash grab, but let's look at it a little bit deeper. Creating an entirely new game based on the originals would be a much more lengthy endeavor, and if it either didn't capture that same feeling or if it just straight up flopped, Capcom would be in some serious financial trouble. Instead, they're taking an easier route and remastering the GameCube remake. Yes, the very same game that changed the fate of the franchise will once again play a part in its destiny. With all the previous interviews, I really think that this is a test. This is Capcom dipping its feet into the water to see if this is what the fans really want. If this game is the victor over Revelations 2, we may just see the game return to its true roots. Even down to a mechanical level, I think they're watching what we say. This version of the game keeps the original tank controls but also allows for analog movement. If they aim for this style in the future, the tank controls may be ditched for the analog control to combine the old style with newer control schemes. I think that it's all going to depend on what we say. As for the graphics, this remaster remains mostly true to the original, but there are some rooms that have been built from scratch because of the ability of newer consoles to handle dynamic lighting. And from what I've seen, it looks like a pretty decent remaster. There's really not much to say besides that. It's Resident Evil 1. Even if you've never played this game before, you've heard of it, and you've probably heard somebody say something good about it. Now, to clarify my opinion on these games, I digitally pre-ordered the remaster, and I honestly don't think I'll be getting Revelations 2. This isn't just me being a jaded hipster screaming from the rooftops, "Their old stuff is better." I just personally know what I'll be getting with the remaster, whereas with the spin-off, I really don't know what to expect. Everyone always talks about voting with your wallet, but this is a situation in which I personally think that it matters. If you want to see more high-def remasters or more old-school styled Resident Evil games, you should really pick up the remaster, which is a couple dollars more than an indie game at $20. And if you're okay with the Revelations style, get the first episode of the sequel in February. This video wasn't to convince you to specifically buy the remaster. It was just to let you know that the big companies that we see as heartless entities are finally starting to really listen to us. Sadly, it's still all for the money, but the fact that they want to give consumers what they want is a step in the right direction. So which Resident Evil game will you be buying? And if none of the above, why? You can let me know in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed my take on this, please give this video a like and subscribe to see more videos from me. Hell, I'll probably even be playing the remaster here on my channel, so if you're not sold on it yet and want to see what all the hubbub is about, you can always tune in to see the game in action for yourself.